Throughout history, there have been people who have committed some of the most heinous crimes fathomable. For those crimes, they have been convicted and sentenced to death. Welcome to Death Row Executions, where we take a look into the lives of society's worst offenders. And now, your host, Air.
Hello everyone, this is Air, and welcome to the 57th episode of Death Row Executions. Today's story is on Romania's leader, Nicolae Ceaușescu, who was overthrown and executed on Christmas Day in 1989. Nicolae Ceaușescu was born on February 5, 1918 in Olt County, Romania. His parents, Alexandrina and Andruța, had 10 children, and they lived on 7 acres of land that his father owned. His mother, Alexandrina, was a very religious woman, but his father was an alcoholic who regularly beat his wife and children. Nicolae was homeschooled until the age of 11, when he ran away to escape his abusive father and extremely religious household. He ran away to his older sister Nicolina's house and eventually became a shoemaker. It was at this first job he learned all he needed to know about communism. The shoe shop he worked at was owned by a man named Alexandru, who was a member of the Communist Party, and mind you, communism was illegal at the time. In 1932, at the young age of 14, Nicolae joined Romania's worker movement and gradually worked his rank up until he became the leader of the Union of Communist Youth. After becoming a leader, he then officially joined a secret communist party. Being that Romania was a monarchy and communism was illegal, Nicolae was arrested for the first time at the age of 15 due to his affiliation with the Communist Party. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison, and when he was let out, over the next couple of years, he was arrested a few more times for getting into fights while there were strikes going on. Every time he was released, though, he was right back in prison, and the secret police knew him as the communist agitator. Prison was rough for teenage Nicolae, and he was beat very bad to the point where it left him with disfigurement and a stutter. In 1936, at the age of 18, he was sentenced to 2 years and 6 months in prison for passing out communist propaganda and for being in contempt of court. He spent his time at Dofteana prison and was released in December of 1938. The following year, he met a woman by the name of Elena who was a textile factory worker. She was very involved in politics as well and supported Nicolae's goals and ambitions when it came to his beliefs on communism. Elena also stayed with him despite him getting locked up again in 1940, 1942, and 1943 for conspiracy against social order. He was sent to different internment camps, and the last one he was at was where he met future communist leader Gheorghe Gheorghiodej. Gheorghe had money and took Nicolae under his wings. They used their money to bribe prison officials to give them a bit more freedom while being locked up, and it worked. In 1944, Romania's monarchy went away and the Red Army came in and communism took over. Romania was now a people's republic filled with Soviet propaganda, and all businesses became nationalized. During this time, Nicolae and Gheorghe were free and rose in rank. Gheorghe became the leader of the Communist Party, and Nicolae not only was known as an enforcer for beating men up who did not seem passionate about the cause, but he also became secretary of the Union of Communist Youth. In 1947, Nicolae married his wife Elena, and that same year was the year Romania lost its last king. It was December of 1947, and Gheorghe, along with Romania's Prime Minister Petru Groza, forced King Michael to step down. They threatened him with a gun, and within hours, he gave up his throne, leaving the Communist Party to take over. The Red Army was in Romania, and they were heavily influenced by Joseph Stalin. Gheorghe was responsible for having his rivals assassinated and did nothing to rid the country of any repressive policies. There was forced unpaid labor, and citizens were expected to give their life, if they had to, for the good of the country as a collective. Nicolae received a promotion and was now working as a major general under Gheorghe. Over the next decade, Joseph Stalin had died, the Red Army left Romania, and there was de-Stalinization happening. USSR influence was going away, and Nicolae was now in the second highest position within the party. In 1965, Gheorghe died of cancer, and just 3 days later, on March 22, 1965, Nicolae assumed his position of General Secretary. He immediately changed his political party name from Romanian Workers' Party to its original name of Communist Party of Romania. He was the first person to create the position President of Romania, so he was officially the first communist president of the country. Nicolae's ultimate goal was for Romania to be a superpower, and if anyone opposed him, they were either sent to prison or put in psychiatric hospitals. In 1971, he ended up taking a trip to North Korea and was very inspired by the leader Kim Il-sung. He loved the dictatorship and how his family all had high positions, so Nicolae decided to do the same thing and eventually hired 27 of his own family members to fill positions within the government and Communist political party. Things were going well, and Nicolae and his wife were dubbed the Great Couple. Elena was known as the Queen and a doctor, despite her having little education. Other countries were starting to recognize Nicolae because of his power and goals of independence. He challenged the Soviet Union and ended Romania's agreement in the Warsaw Pact, amongst other things. To everyone else, he appeared to be a strong man, but within, he struggled. He was self-conscious about his appearance and also lived an extremely paranoid life. He ended up hiring a chemist that would eradicate his feces so that no one would be able to learn of his health. After touching anyone, he always made sure to sanitize his hands, and whenever he ate with others, he would refuse the food because he only felt safe eating from his personal chef. He still had that underlying anger and violence, and it's been said that if food was presented to him, he would often throw it on the floor and step on it afterwards. His domineering, controlling, and hypocritical behavior was not just geared towards the country, but within his family circle as well. In 1966, Nicolae banned abortion and all forms of contraception in order for the population to grow, and approximately 10,000 women died because of harmful abortion practices. Many babies were abandoned, and the country's orphanages were in horrible conditions. Back at home, he found out his son's girlfriend was pregnant, but the new rule did not apply to her, and he forced her to have an abortion so that the two of them would be able to split. The country as a whole was in turmoil, but Nicolae would give many speeches, always disconnected from his people and showing a different side of Romania. He visited other countries like India, United States, United Kingdom, Australia, China, Egypt, and Spain. In the eyes of other countries, Romania was becoming more recognized. Romania also became the first country from the Warsaw Pact to do many things. He was able to be the first to get a visit from President Nixon. He was able to join trade agreements, and he was the first to recognize West Germany and the first to join the International Monetary Fund. Nicolae was also the only one to keep diplomatic relations with Israel. He was very eager to get respect from many different nations and show the world how great Romania was. He was the reason US and China were able to negotiate international affairs in 1969, and was also the reason Egyptian president at the time Anwar Sadat took a trip to Israel. Also, when most Eastern nations or communist countries boycotted the 1984 Summer Olympics in Los Angeles, California, Romania still participated. Romania was in the 1980 Olympics in Moscow as well. Participating in the Olympics was great for Romania because Nadia Comaneci got the first ever perfect 10 in Olympic gymnastic history. Unfortunately, the Romanian delegation did not allow Nadia to communicate with other gymnasts, so she had a hard time at the Olympics. Back in Romania, Nicolae did not allow Nadia to leave the country after the Olympics, except for a few visits to Moscow and Cuba. The big star she was around the world did not matter, and she too was subjugated to the effects of Nicolae's rules. She later fled Romania, walking mostly on foot with other Romanian defectors before being able to catch a plane flight to America. She said that she was unhappy with the difficult living conditions and personal freedom. Later on in her memoir, she wrote, "Life took on a new bleakness. I was cut off from making the small amount of extra money that had already made a difference in my family's life. It was also insulting that a normal person in Romania had a chance to travel, whereas I could not. When my gymnastics career was over, there was no longer any need to keep me happy. I was to do as I was instructed, just as I'd done my entire life. I started to feel like a prisoner." During the 80s, things began to get progressively worse. Nicolae began to kill many people who opposed him, and no one was allowed to speak out about being oppressed. The Romanian people were now under strict rules, and during its coldest winters, the heating was restricted, so people were left to get heat and power off of the black market. They were only allotted an hour a day of TV time, and only given more time if they were watching communist propaganda. There was also a restriction on food, so people had to ration necessities for weeks up to a month, and many were dying of hunger. Much of the lack of food came only because they were exporting it for money, which benefited everyone but the Romanian people. The citizens of Romania were also made to work up to 3 shifts, 7 days a week, in order to pay Nicolae's debts. With all of this going on, there was surprisingly still tourism, but as a tourist, the only thing you would be able to watch on TV was information on Nicolae, and newspapers were full of photos of him as well. Certain things like soda and gum were forbidden to citizens, but tourists were able to buy these things in certain shops, but were only allowed to use foreign currency. The Romanian people were becoming more and more angry, but because Nicolae was so detached from his people and so used to being in control and in charge, he was unaware of just how angry his people were. Not only did the citizens have enough, but the people within the Communist Party did as well. There was a revolution brewing, and in March of 1989, 6 members of the Romanian Communist Party wrote an open letter to Nicolae that criticized his governing. This letter was sent to media outlets around the world. They did not resent communism, but resented Nicolae and questioned things he did. They renamed themselves the National Salvation Front and also came up with a new flag that eliminated the coat of arms. On December 16, 1989, the revolution began. Many protests were in different cities, and bloodshed followed. In the city of Timișoara, the protests were so powerful that it inspired protest in Bucharest. Nicolae ordered military to go in these cities, but the citizens did not care. Military was also angered because they were sent with no bullets, so even if something were to happen, they would not be able to defend themselves. On December 21, 1989, President Nicolae gave his final speech to the people to condemn the revolution. He and his family were still very disconnected from the people, and he believed the majority still loved him and would stand by his side. The crowd looked like a big crowd, but police and soldiers rounded up people from neighboring areas and forced them to hold posters of Nicolae and Elena. The first few rows in the crowd were true supporters, but after that, many were not. In his speech, he talked about how great the socialist revolution was, and in his own words, blamed rioters of being fascist agitators who wanted to destroy socialism. After 8 minutes of speaking, this occurred.
Doresc de asemenea să adresez mulțumiri inițiatorilor și organizatorilor acestei mari manifestări populare din București, considerând aceasta ca o Așezați-vă liniștiți! Cobareș! 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 Așezați-vă liniștiți! Alo! Alo! Cobareș! Așezați-vă liniștiți! Așezați-vă liniștiți la locurile voastre. Asta e o provocare. Alo? Alo?
Așezați-vă liniștiți, stați liniștiți.
Cetățeni ai capitalei, pleceți înapoi, tovarăși.
Stați liniștiți. Stați liniștiți. Liniștiți. Liniște, vorbește. Alo?
Încă o dată doresc să subliniez că trebuie să demonstrăm cu toată puterea.
During the disturbance, video went off air, but audio was still being recorded. People booed and began to chant Timișoara. Nicolae was confused and in dismay. No one had ever done this before at any of his speeches. In another angle, you could see people marching toward the People's Palace, or today it's called the Revolution Square, where the speech was being held. Soldiers and secret police began to shoot citizens. When order was finally restored, Elena encouraged her husband to speak, and he went from talking about how great Romania was to how he was going to increase everyone's salary and increase other forms of payment to Romanian people. As the speech went on, the roars and cheers became more of heckles and boos. Nicolae's facial expression was that of confusion. Disturbance erupted again, and he and everyone else on the balcony went inside for safety. Rioters filled the streets for hours, but by night the military was able to clear the streets. Nicolae, still not aware of the seriousness of the revolution, planned to give a speech the next morning. On December 22, 1989, the day after his speech, Nicolae had his defense minister killed, claiming that he took his own life and took control of the military himself. No one believed that the defense minister, Vasile Milea, took his own life, so soldiers decided to no longer protect Nicolae and joined the revolution side instead. More and more people within the party lost their loyalty, and the same communist members, now with the National Salvation Front, went on radio and TV to announce the new name and agenda. People forced their way into the People's Palace, and Nicolae made a last-ditch effort to calm the crowd down, but once things started being thrown his way, he had no choice but to retreat. Nicolae, his wife, and 4 others took an elevator in an attempt to make it to the roof so they could escape by helicopter because protesters were now inside. The electricity went out, and one of Nicolae's bodyguards forced the door open of the elevator in order to escort them to the roof. The helicopter was being flown by Nicolae's personal pilot by the name of Vasile Multan. It was around 11:20 a.m. when Vasile landed, and around 11:40 when he finally saw Nicolae and Elena, flush white, being helped by bodyguards. The helicopter was only able to seat 4, but there were 6 in the party. When they took off, protesters were now on the roof, and many people were filled with emotions, but it was not over yet. The helicopter made it to Snagov, and Nicolae had a meeting where he requested 2 helicopters with soldiers and guards to come get him. When the pilot called his unit commander, he informed him that there was a revolution, that they were on their own, and finished the call by saying, "Good luck." Vasile did not relay this information to Nicolae, but told him the helicopter was ready to take off, but he could only take 4 people. The vice president, Maneo Mănescu, and a communist politician, Emil Bobu, stayed behind while the helicopter took off. Nicolae then requested to be taken to a city called Titu, and when they were near, Vasile dipped the helicopter and lied and told Nicolae that he flew low to avoid anti-aircraft fire. Now, even more scared, Nicolae asked him to land, and they were now traveling on foot. The bodyguards that were with Nicolae and Elena flagged passerbys. A doctor stopped them, but faked engine failure because he was uncomfortable transporting them. They then had to hitch a ride with someone else, and they got into the car of a man named Nicolae Petrusor. He told them that he would be able to successfully hide them in Târgoviște. Unbeknownst to Nicolae, he was being tricked, and when they arrived at an agricultural technical institute Petrusor brought them to, he locked all of them in a room and called the police. It was now 3:30 p.m. when police arrived, and they were taken to a military compound and held as prisoners for 3 days until their trial. A day before their trial, leader of the National Salvation Front, Ion Iliescu, signed an order for a drumhead court-martial against Nicolae and Elena. There were many charges, with the most heinous one being genocide. It was Christmas Day, December 25, 1989, when the trial began. Nicolae and Elena were still in the same clothes they had on 4 days prior. One of the men in charge of handling out the execution said that Nicolae smelled fine, but Elena smelled horrible. They both acted normal during their trial, while they were being told they caused thousands to die by having no heat and no electricity. Nicolae denied everything and denied being the cause of anyone dying. He demanded a fair trial, but after 2 hours, they were sentenced to death.
Prin lipsă de căldură, prin lipsă de lumină. Dar cea mai odioasă crimă a fost crima de a îngătușa spiritul românesc, sufletul acestui popor.
E o minciună, recunosc că am părăsat poporul, vă spun ca să vă gândiți bine că e o minciună în fals și arată acum cât de lipsă de patriotism și ce trădare s-a comis în țara.
Dacă vreți să ne omorâți la amândoi. Împreună. Nu. Împreună. Împreună. Nu, să o ăștia. Împreună. Ce vrei să faci? Ce asta? Ce asta? Nu le legați. Nu puneți mâna. Nu le legați. Nu le
să mă prezint cum vreau. Nu să merg
și de acolo. Nu e voie să le legați. Nu le legați. Nu le legați, mă, e rușine. E rușine, v-am crescut ca o mamă. Dați la un loc, mă. Și ia, mă, rupeți mâna, dați-mi drumul la mână. Dați-mi drumul. Ce faceți așa? Noi suntem aici așa, pe cine?
Three paratroopers who were in charge of the firing squad put all of their guns on automatic. Nicolae and Elena were initially going to be executed separately, but caused a fuss and requested to be killed together. One of the paratroopers, who was caught crying in court and later saying that they deserved the execution, asked if they could be granted their last wish. Their wish was granted, and another paratrooper brought string because he was going to tie the couple up. Elena did not like this and protested, but this wish of not having their hands tied behind their backs was not granted. They were taken out to the courtyard, and after being shot in the knee and chest, Nicolae died first and his wife followed. The execution happened too fast, and the cameraman came when everything was over, but he filmed their bodies on the ground, and that was televised for all of Romania. There is a reenactment on YouTube you will be able to see if you are interested. People were in the streets cheering, celebrating, and of course exchanging gifts in the streets because it was Christmas. The very next day, Ion Iliescu was elected the second president of Romania. Nicolae and Elena were buried next to each other, but a few decades later, their bodies were exhumed because family members did not believe it was their bodies in the grave. A DNA test was conducted that proved Nicolae was truly Nicolae, but there was not enough material to conduct a proper test on Elena, so she was not confirmed. Their bodies were then reburied in a different location at the same cemetery, and their 62-year-old son at the time, Valentin, said that he was confident it was his parents that were in the graves. Thank you all for watching another episode of Death Row Executions. If you enjoyed this story, please give this video a like for me. And now for discussion and question time. When an oppressive leader takes control like Nicolae and Hitler, for example, what do you think it takes for people to find enough courage to overthrow that leader? Unlike World War II, when British troops liberated camps, the Romanian people did things on their own. I think it takes strength and courage for people who are trained to be submissive and not speak out to finally stand with each other and fight for what's right. I think of the military soldiers who blindly shot and killed protesters for being in the wrong, but just because Nicolae killed their commander, they decided to now be on the side they once killed. Before I go, I would like to give a shout out to Ricky, Roma, Ella White, and Damien. Thank you guys so much for becoming patrons on my Patreon. Also, Damien has a YouTube channel that I will put in the description box below where he sings nice covers. Here is a little example of his work.
I can see you over there staring at your drink, watching that I smell all alone tonight. And chances are you're sitting here in this bar 'cause he ain't gonna treat you right. Well, it's probably not my place, but I'm gonna say it anyway, 'cause you look like you haven't felt the fire, had a little fun, even had a smile in a little while, my baby. Blue looks good on the sky, looks good on that neon buzzing on the wall, but darling, it don't match your eyes. I'm telling you, you don't need that guy. It's so black and white, he's stealing your thunder. Baby, blue ain't your color. I'm not trying to be another just pick you up kind of guy, trying to drink you up, trying to take you home. I just don't understand how another man can take your sun and turn it ice cold. Well, I've had enough to drink, and it's making me think that I just might.
I think he's great, so please check him out if you enjoyed that clip.
I just paint you bright, my baby.